Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SSP Scholarly Kitchen webinar, The Future of the Big Deal, No Deal, or Even Bigger Deal. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, chair of the SSP webinar working group, and we're pleased you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started and hear from our moderator and panelists. You'll be seeing the SSP splash screen during this webinar, since this is a discussion and there will be no slides. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature on your toolbar to send in questions, and if you need to let us know if you're having technical difficulties. The moderator will review questions and present them to the panelists. To help him, please specify to which presenter you would like your question directed, and also please send in your questions as we go instead of waiting to the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so that we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link by email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to any materials that are available. Our moderator today is Roger Schoenfeld, Director of Library and Scholarly Communications Program for Ithaca SNR and a prolific chef at the Scholarly Kitchen. In this role, Roger leads studies of academics and students' attitudes, practices, and needs, as well as research on the changing role of the academic library, learned society, and scholarly publishers. I'll turn the webinar now over to Roger so that he can introduce the panel and get us started.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm really thrilled to be able to participate in a panel on such a timely topic for our community today. And we have three terrific panelists joining us to really take the lead in discussing this set of issues. Just alphabetically, first we have Rick Anderson, who's the Associate Dean for Collections and Scholarly Communications at the University of Utah's Library. Rick is an immediate past president of SSP, a regular contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen, and certainly a major thinker on the library perspective on issues around open access and scholarly communications. We have Liam Ernie, who is the director of GISC Collections. He negotiates and is involved in licensing a wide range of content agreements on behalf of universities, colleges, and museum libraries on a sector-wide basis in the UK, and has really taken the lead on a number of projects on copyright and licensing, knowledge base, and similar kinds of issues. And then finally, Jean Shipman, who is the Vice President of Global Library Relations and Global Strategic Networks for Elsevier. Jean takes responsibility for building relationships across the library community, deep and mutually beneficial relationships, particularly in the academic and research sectors. And she formerly served as the executive director of the Spencer Eccles Health Sciences Library at the University of Utah. So three fantastic panelists bringing different views and helping us to discuss some really timely issues. Now, we're talking today about the big deal and whether the big deal is going to get bigger or disappear, or what's the future of the big deal. And I wanted to just get us started by offering up a few parameters or definitions around what the big deal actually is. So many of you are familiar with this and may have even more nuanced understandings of it than I do, but the big deal represents licensed access to substantially all of a publisher's annual output. Often it's restricted to journals, though those restrictions to journals are something that we're going to be talking about today. And that licensed access is typically provided on a multi-year basis with some kind of agreed upon price increases across the term of that agreement. Typically, the big deal involves journals and other content being made available on a site licensed basis rather than to a small subset of the affiliates of the licensing entity. There is a lot of feedback coming through, so I wonder if there are any panelists who are in a loud spot who would like to just mute themselves. That made a big difference. Thank you so much. So with that as background about how we might think about the big deal, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to think a little bit about how much of a typical library's collections and how much of a typical library's budget is going into these sorts of deals versus subscriptions or purchased access to individual journals or books or other kinds of content. How, from the library perspective, how big is the big deal? And maybe we'll just start in order. Rick, would you like to start, and then we'll mix it up for future questions?
Sure. So at my library, we have two genuine big deal packages. We have Elsevier's Freedom Collection, and we have the Wiley Comprehensive Journal package. The Elsevier collection represents about 17% of our total materials budget, and the Wiley Journal package represents about 11% of our total budget. Those are pretty big tranches of the budget. What I don't have a good sense of, and this is going to require this would require some significant research, would be to figure out what percentage of the total articles that we offer our students and faculty are represented in those packages. So we spend about 17% of our materials budget on Elsevier journals. Does that represent roughly 17% of the articles that we make available to our community? I'm not sure. But for us, those are the two genuine big deal packages that we have, and then we have an array of sort of smaller subject-based journal packages as well.
Liam, can I turn to you for your thoughts on the scale of the big deal from a library perspective?
So in the UK, I think it would be typical for perhaps over 50% of budget to be going on the top 5 or 6 publishers. I think it's really interesting to talk about a typical library. We have a very diverse library community, so the amount of spend on big deals will be very different across institutions, even if they are perhaps ostensibly having access to the same content. I've heard of institutions where 35% of their entire materials budget is going on one agreement. And I think to come back on something that Rick said, even within those big deals, the big 4 publishers account for a huge proportion of overall expenditure and the number of journals that they publish. If you're looking at over 2,000 or so journals for each of those major publishers, Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and Springer Nature, whom we have agreements with in the UK.
And then, Jean, from your perspective, we'd love to hear from you on this question as well.
Well, this is a great one for me because I can play both sides from my background and then from my current position. But I think the advantages of big deals are that it does help with the transaction costs for libraries to have to deal with individual titles and different vendors. But I do agree in the past that the costs are a little, you feel like you want to give everyone fair advantage to the access. But Rick's percent for Elsevier, 17%, I found very interesting because we have analyzed how many articles we publish, and we represent about 16% of the output globally. So 16 and 17 are pretty close percent-wise. So I think it's to be, most people that look at breaking the big deals find that the costs are still advantageous per use to have the big deals. I know of a couple that just have not been able to sustain that, a couple libraries, but I think in the long run, everyone has to analyze what's best for their library.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, both the sort of percentage of the budget encumbered by these models, but also how they connect with output or collection size. I mean, certainly you hear from some librarians that feel that they've, almost to the extent that they've lost control of their materials budgets as a result of these models. But clearly the range of percentages, as Rick and Liam are emphasizing, will vary. What's the trajectory here? What do you see happening among libraries with the big deal? Do you see libraries that are abandoning it? I mean, Jean, you just mentioned that doesn't seem to be very widespread. To the extent that there are any libraries stepping away from it, are they doing so because it isn't affordable? Are they doing so to make a statement? Are they doing so really just to position themselves in future negotiations? Are they doing so to promote open access? What's the dynamic at play there? Whether you see it as a gathering trend or something something relatively isolated. Jean, since you sort of moved in that direction already, maybe I can ask you to start. Just what's the direction here?
Sure. And I think it's like Liam said, I don't know if there's a standard trend for anything, but I haven't heard of a lot of people moving away from it, but I do know that everyone's looked at that possibility, or it seems like everyone has. And that's because librarians are great stewards of the collection funding that they do get. I guess I hope that institutions really evaluate what the gain would be from moving away, and then also what the cons are from moving away, and really assess for themselves what's the best picture. I would hope also that librarians, and I know they do, educate administrators needing more funding in order to keep up with the volume of research, since it is exponentially growing. The more content, of course, one knows that, someone has to pay for the cost of producing that content. And as more researchers are relying on that production for their promotion, who should support that? So I'm hoping that more institutions can see more value in what they're getting from research publications and then contribute to the library for that increase.
Excuse me, Liam, can we turn to you next?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think clearly some institutions are abandoning it, and some consortia are looking at whether they can abandon big deals. And though on the other hand, you have other institutions joining and new consortia signing up to big deals at the same time. So I'm not sure there's one picture. What I do think you have institutions and consortiums taking a very careful review of their big deals and considering what their options are, considering, is it being used, is it being cited, is it value for money? So do they have an option to exit one or more big deals, and how would they provide access to essential content if they don't have a big deal? I think it's also worth bearing in mind that big deals aren't static. Certainly from our point of view, we see within the context of one overall negotiation, many more options being provided that cater for different needs of different types of institution within our consortium. So we might have subject packages, we might be seeking the inclusion of open access, we might be seeking the support for green open access, etc. Different year ranges of content made available. So we try and provide maximum flexibility for all of our members and the maximum amount of content that they need, but try and really align their subscriptions with their institutional ambitions and ability to maintain access to this content.
And Rick, would you like to weigh in as well?
Yeah, the point that occurs to me as I listen to this discussion is that in this, as in so many other domains, it's really important to keep the issue of value and the issue of cost somewhat separate in our minds, right? So I'm not aware of any library, even the ones that complain the loudest about the big deal. I'm not aware of any library that doesn't think it's getting, at least reasonably good value for money in return for its big deal dollars. Especially at a medium to large size research institution. If you've got access to something like the Freedom Collection, chances are good you're paying at most, $2 or $3 per downloaded article. Now, you may have suspicions about the accuracy of the download data, and there are going to be outliers that are seeing higher or lower per article costs. But to my knowledge, most people are not making an argument against the value of the big deal. The big problem that we tend to run into with the big deal is its affordability, which of course is a completely separate issue from value. No matter how good a value it is, if you don't have enough money in your budget to cover it, then you're in trouble. And what many of us are finding is that over the years, we've had to redirect so much money from other areas, in particular from book purchases, in order to cover the annual cost increases of the Big Deal and other journals and journal packages. That's why we're in trouble. It's not that these aren't great products that offer good value. It's just that we're running out of money. And that's not necessarily a criticism of the model itself. It's just every model is going to have upsides and downsides, and one of the downsides of the Big Deal model is that it costs a lot of money.
I think,
go ahead.
So I think it's really important. I mean, yes, I think Rick's right in many cases, but that's not that doesn't apply across the board. And I think what we're trying to do is make sure that if an institution subscribes to a Big Deal, they at least have some sense that this represents good value for them. And we try not to encourage all of our members to take all of the Big Deal options that we make available. I think recognizing that diversity of institutions and the fact that they won't all get the same value is really important. I do think that lock-in of money is a massive issue for institutions with Big Deals.
So there are a couple of threads there that I want to try to pick up on, but it does seem that I think we've sort of talked through some of the things that make the Big Deal problematic, even though even if they're offering access to more content at a lower price point per use than an individual subscription would. I mean, it seems like this question, Liam, that you raise about lock-in of money, this question, Rick, that you raise about not just thinking about value, even if it is, as you say, quite high, but that the value for money is quite high, but that inherent budget limitations are a challenge. So one of the things that, there's been a number of really interesting developments in the Big Deal landscape over the last year or couple of years. One of the things that some of us have been tracking on is the introduction and perhaps the growing introduction of other material types beyond journals being added along into the Big Deal, book collections, the book outputs of certain major scientific publishers being first item that comes to mind. So I wonder all three of you if you could reflect a little bit about to what extent books are being added to journals. Is that something that you see the publishers being especially enthusiastic about? Is that something you see really adding to libraries? Flexibility in terms of, Rick, your observation that journals, the Big Deal for journals has been squeezing out books, or is that an example, Liam, of what you're pointing to of just locking more money into these models? I wonder who'd like to start there.
I'm happy to chime in. Oh, Jean, after you. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I was just going to say, I think what we're going to see in time, and it seems to be accelerating even faster than I anticipated, is the loss of the containers as we know them. So books and journals will stay for a little bit and it'll morph, but I think we're already seeing that morphing happen, in that with multimedia and the online delivery of content, you can add so much more robustness to the print that makes it much more understandable. And I think what we'll see is the whole goal, I know, for Elsevier is to increase research performance and help researchers. So I think we're going to see the way that this will go will be incorporating even more multimedia that will help research be able to be understood by not only those conducting it, but by the general public. As science is coming under more public scrutiny about the value, I think multimedia can help to explain science in a whole new way. So I'm kind of trying to think myself, not of a container, but of the information that's being transferred.
So from my perspective, we've been very wary of adding books into Big Deals. I think if there is a sense at an institutional level that some of these agreements are already too big to fail, adding books into them makes it seem like an even less appealing lock-in than you might have had before. We do have agreements for books, big deals for books, but we have really erred on the side of caution about adding those into our journal agreements, and it's not something we've taken forward in the UK.
Liam, can I just get you to clarify that? So you're saying you'll have like separate, if you like, big deal style agreements for books. You tend to prefer those rather than bundling the books and the journals of a single publisher together. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. We might have some options, but we've really steered very clear of it, and there is much wariness of that as a direction of travel from institutions. It's something we discuss as a consortium regularly. You know, should we be getting more of the content, more of the services into some of these big deals to get an even better price per download? I think there is a sense that having done that, we would struggle even more with that issue of the absolute price that we see as an issue that Rick mentioned earlier. I think Jean touched on an interesting thing as well, actually, about innovation in terms of content. And one of the challenges for institutions with these big deals is the extent to which it does limit their ability to innovate in terms of their collections. I have library directors say to me, one of their concerns about big deals is that they have lost sovereignty in terms of collection management and development, that they can't maybe afford to engage with some of the more innovative publishers that they might have wanted to. So you end up with a situation sometimes where the only innovation happens within the budget envelope of the big deals that you're already signed up to.
And Rick, would you like to talk about books and journals and multiple media types as well?
Yeah. So at our institution, we've been pretty aggressive in terms of shifting from a librarian-driven to a patron-driven or demand-driven acquisition model for books. And of course, we started with ebooks, which is where that's most obviously doable. But actually, recently, we've implemented a patron-driven model for acquiring print books as well. And because we're so invested in that idea generally, that naturally leads us away from a big deal type model. In fact, a big deal for books is exactly the opposite of the kind of acquisition that we're trying to move towards. So for us, the question of a big deal for books it's not so much one of, is this the most cost-effective way to do it? It's more, is this philosophically in keeping with our collection development strategies generally? And the answer, for the most part, is no. And in light of that, we've actually been really frustrated by our experiences with some publishers who only want to sell their ebooks in packages, and in particular their frontlist titles, and that's been troublesome for us.
So I'm hearing the two sort of library representatives here, Rick and Liam, sort of having some questions about models that make the big deal bigger in terms of, at least in terms of material types. Jean, before we move on, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything further you want to add to that, because I certainly hear about this a lot, and I want to make sure we're not skewing in one direction or another.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think with adding books. I know in science directors both, so I think that it's just something. Again, I'm not so sure. The question will be: are we adding books, or are we adding even more multimedia that can be applied in different ways? And how do we price for that? If we are, let's say, adding patient education videos, or the mix is even going to get more complex, and I think it's going to have to be a negotiation that happens at each local level. What works. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So we're talking about sort of making bigger deals bigger in terms of content, that's one potential direction. Another potential direction takes us in the direction of open access, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about open access. So there are some consortia, I believe JISC is one of them, that has been working towards big deal models that have also come to include some provision for covering open access APCs. And that seems to be a trend, certainly in some of the European consortia as well. Liam, maybe I can ask you to start us off here and talk about what's driving some of these models, what's driving the strategic thinking here, and then we can hear from Rick and Jean if they'd like to weigh in as well.
Okay, sure. So, well, I think the first thing to say is the strategy to try and affect a swift transition to open access. We have a policy environment, certainly in the UK and in many other European countries, where government and funders want to see open access, and that they are, in many cases, willing to support the funding of APCs in hybrid and pure gold journals. We took a view in the UK that if open access was going to happen unevenly across the world, and that we as a research-intensive country were going to be leading the way in this, that we were likely to see a substantial increase in both APC costs and subscription costs in the first instance before double-dipping policies and initiatives came into effect. So we wanted to use the existing relationships that we had, the existing leverage that we had via our agreements, to allow them to cover both subscriptions and APCs, and by doing so to constrain costs, to support institutions complying with funder mandates, etc., to hopefully support a swift transition to open access, and really, I suppose, support the requirements that were being placed on institutions and the challenges that they were facing. It's also a strategy which recognizes that for many of our institutions, the major publishers that we work with are also a significant destination for the output of their authors. They are the places where many of our authors go to publish. But I do want to say just one thing. We are also very wary of the unintended consequences of some of these agreements, and we're also aware of the fact that it can look like just a lock-in for some of the bigger publishers that we're working with already. So it's important to us that we work with a wide range of publishers, pure gold publishers, open access monograph initiatives, and things like that alongside these agreements.
Jean or Rick, would you like to talk a little bit about the model of adding some provision for open access fees or APCs into the big deal model?
Well,
go ahead, Rick.
No, please, you go. Okay, I'll go.
Mute.
Go ahead, Jean,
I'll take a firmer hand going forward.
It's okay. It's all about the tech button, I think that open access is really something that a lot of people are wanting to go to, and I've been surprised personally how open Elsevier is thinking as well. And I think that will surprise some people, but we are really investigating how to be successful going to open, and it takes a time to flip models, as you can only imagine. But I did learn that Elsevier looks at journals constantly and kind of evaluates if a journal starts to become quite APC heavy, then it will look at flipping it to a gold model. If a gold model tends to be not getting the content it needs, then it can flip back to a subscription model. So I think we're seeing very volatile markets here and a lot of testing. And I have heard in different conferences that some libraries will gain for their collection budget as far as APC payments versus subscriptions, and others will lose as far as their volume being more, requiring more costs from their collection budget if the collection were to pay the APC. So I think, it varies by country, it varies by institution. The output of the institution is really important. And I guess, again, I double checked that we do at Elsevier remove any costs for APCs from subscription costs. So if APCs are added back in, then that will even add more costs in my mind. So that's kind of, you know, I've been really looking at this and thinking, yes, it would be great to all be open, but how do we do it in a sustainable model that doesn't hurt our research output and also harm those who are authoring our research output? Because it's really them, you know, if I could stop the world, I'd really want to work with our authors to kind of assess what they're contributing to this whole world of publication, because their tenure requirements are encouraging them to produce even more volumes coming out. We see more volume in our production instead of less. But how do we model that then to be sustainable for everyone? Is what keeps me awake at night.
And I guess I'll just add that I've found it very, very interesting how different the policy landscapes are between the UK and the US, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. But one of the very big policy differences, or one of the big differences in the landscape, is that, of course, in the US, we don't have a centralized system of higher education. And what that means is we don't have a mechanism that can be used to create policy around issues like publishing practices in any kind of centralized way. And so whereas in the UK, there's a very clear vision for moving in the direction of open access at a national level, there's really nothing like that in the US. The closest thing that we have is the White House Office of Science and Technology policy memo that is compared to the UK's approach is a much more tentative, and it points federal funders in the direction of public access rather than open access, and does it in a much softer way.
I think the policy landscape the policy aspect is very important, but I wouldn't underestimate the desire of institutions to policy mandates are not the only reason that we're pursuing open access in this way. And from a GIST point of view, we've been supporting open access for well over a decade now, and before some of the stronger policy mandates came into effect.
And that points to another big difference, I guess, more a cultural one than a political one between the US and the UK, and that is that in the US, there is effectively zero institutional interest in implementing OA mandates. There are lots of open access policies at institutions around the US. None of them that I'm aware of are actually mandatory, with the exception of Duke University, which requires its PhD students to make their dissertations available on an OA CCBY basis. That's the only example of a true mandate that I've found at a US institution of higher ed, public or private.
Now, we've already started talking a little bit about double dipping, but I did want to just make sure that everyone has had whatever chance they'd like to weigh in on this question, because some publishers, including Elsevier, have stated that they do undertake global offsetting to avoid double dipping, which is to say reducing an overall subscription price for a hybrid journal in line with the amount of OA papers that they publish. Do we want to discuss any further how that fits in with these bigger deals that require local offsetting? This is a level of detail that I think matters a great deal, but I have to confess is a little bit obscure to me. One way of framing this is short of making their accounting books fully open to the public, what can publishers do to convince their customers, some of whom are quite suspicious, that these offsets are real and effective?
I'll jump in here. I think one thing is the timeline that we all deal with in setting prices. And in order to really get a count of how many APCs to offset with a subscription, there has to be almost a year, at least in retro, of when you're setting prices. So it's not as dynamic as maybe it should be in being able to be really clear, like, of what's currently being published by an institution. But again, I've heard so many conferences where some people say the OA model is not going to be any cheaper. In fact, it may be more costly, but it does provide that openness, which we all say is the key element behind a desire for OA. But I think we need to really look at rather libraries perhaps are double dipping by asking for even more reduction in subscription if they've already got the offset for the APC, if they're even adding more APC desire onto that. So double dipping can go both ways, but I would really encourage every librarian to work with your sales reps and really ask the question, like, what amount of this is being, reduced because of the APC before you, to build that trust, really.
I think it's fair to say in a UK context, I don't have many librarians approaching me with the challenge that they are paying too little into the publishers that we work with. I think the big debate that I see in the UK is actually looking at the model that we have and the manner in which we're implementing it, and wondering about the increased financial exposure because of it, and whether that is a direction that is sustainable, especially if it's not supporting a transition to open access. Are we just buying more open access without actually inspiring other countries to follow our lead? I think that's the challenge and the fear of many of the people that I encounter. I think also I would just say, in a big deal model, to an extent, we've broken that absolute link between how much we pay for a particular journal or particular articles, and therefore it's kind of strange to see it reintroduced in the APC market.
Rick, did you want to add anything to this discussion?
I don't think so.
That's fine. I mean, I think that more broadly, there really is a question that one of the questions that's come in, and I certainly would encourage others who may have questions to contribute them, is, since we're talking about APCs and offsetting, what effect has the open access movement had on the big deal, on negotiations for the big deal? We sometimes think about open access as, has it flipped things or what have you, but has it strengthened the hands of libraries at the negotiating table in any meaningful way that any of the three of you can see? The question was asked of Rick and Liam, but certainly I'd be interested in Jean's take on it as well.
I guess I'll just jump in and say, in my experience, or from my perspective, no, it hasn't. I think one of the reasons for that is that journals and journal content operate in a market of complements rather than a market of substitutes. So I think that what the OA movement has really succeeded at doing is making a lot of new content that would otherwise have been behind paywalls freely available. But what it hasn't done is drive any journals out of business. And what saves a library money is canceling journals. The appearance of additional free journals doesn't save the library any money. We just come under pressure to make those journals discoverable by our patrons, but they don't say, oh, and now you can cancel your subscription to the Lancet. So what OA has really succeeded at doing is making additional content freely available, but I don't see yet that it's saving libraries any money. And somebody might argue with me on that, and they may have good data, but from my perspective, that's what I'm saying.
Liam, would you tend to agree with that, or do you have a different perspective about that?
I think there's an awful lot of truth in what Rick said from meetings I attend with library directors. I think that, in fact, I heard one today bemoaning the fact that we were just adding more and not saving any costs on what was there already. I do, however, think that however, having said that, I know that we're making much more available via our negotiations at a cheaper cost than would otherwise be the case. So I don't think it's a message of despair to a certain extent. I think that we are in an environment now, certainly for myself, where we seem to be in almost perpetual negotiation with many publishers. We don't have the luxury that we perhaps had once upon a time of we secure an agreement and then not speak to a publisher for another 2 years or something like that. We are in constant discussion as we look at the models, iterate the models, develop, etc., test, and all the rest of it. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think we're playing a more active participatory role in the process than was previously the case. And I think that's to an extent a sign of maturity. And I would also say, you know, with a lot of the publishers that we work with, we have many more productive and constructive discussions than was the case a few years ago, when it might just have been an argument over what's the percentage change going to be, which was a fairly dull and not particularly interesting conversation to be in after a while.
And is that, and can I ask you, because I think this actually really is a broader question than Liam, is that because of things like books and APCs and double dipping, or the nature of the conversations that are, as you say, more interesting than just a percentage increase about other things that we haven't yet talked about?
It's about workflows. It's about the language in websites and the landing pages that authors are on. It's about the licenses which are used, the reporting, the transparency, service levels, and things like that. It's about a host of issues which, you know, start to go right the way across the life cycle, or one part of the life cycle at least of research output, rather than just the final licensing and procurement part of it.
Right. Before we move forward, Jean, do you want to share anything else about you know, whether open access has you know, had an impact on the negotiating table? I don't want to force you into that since it wasn't part of what we were planning to talk about, but I did want to make sure not to omit. Yeah,
I would like to add about the hidden costs in publishing with volumes. And that's where the articles that are in subscriptions, the ones that get rejected. And as the volumes increase, but the containers, you know, don't allow even more volume to be published, it gets more quality, you could say, because there's more selection of what does get published. But there's also more chaff that has to be filtered through to get to those quality articles. And who pays that cost? With subscriptions, it's been the publisher that's had to kind of build that cost. But with APCs, it's kind of, you know, is it allowing even more non-quality material to be published because the author's willing or somehow has come up with the money for the article? So I think, you know, there could be where some, I don't know. I don't know my economics enough to know where that balance is between those two, but in some ways, open access is costing a little bit more because perhaps it's providing more output that normally wouldn't have been. I know there's been tons of discussions about that, but there is a lot of hidden cost in the current subscription model.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I just wonder what Jean thinks about, you know, the role of cascade titles, cascade journals, and things like that in moderating those costs. I know that we as a consortium work very hard to evaluate the publishers, the open access publishers, all the publishers that we have agreements with. I also saw some research which looked at APCs across all journals, Pure Gold, Hybrid, etc., and compared that with field-weighted citation impacts, and there didn't seem to be any linkage there at all. You could have a hybrid journal with a very high APC, which had a very low impact factor, and some very highly rated Pure Gold journals with a very low APC.
Yeah, it's a good question, you know. But I think going back to the premise of the desire for open access being really the freeing up of knowledge and the transfer of knowledge. And I think, again, I would encourage all of us to work with our institution and our authors to understand and see if there's some shifting in that kind of level of our institutions that can be done to help with this dilemma that libraries and publishers are facing collectively, actually. We both share in different ways into this whole problem that's coming from structure, at least in the US, where in order to promote, you need to publish and publish in quality journals that are recognized by their brand if you're a junior researcher in order to get the promotion. And if we can sway that, I think might be where we can take more direction in the future than what we've done. So far, we've tried to deal with it ourselves, as librarians often do. We cut more and then want people to recognize that we cut. And if it's not harming them, it's not harming them, you know? So making it a bigger problem that's not just libraries and publishers alone, but engaging the whole academy in this discussion, I think is something we need to think about doing more in the future.
So no one who's been following my writing over the last 6 or 12 months will be surprised to hear that the most, the direction that I want to make sure we have a chance to focus on in this conversation in terms of ways that the big deal could get bigger yet is some of these research workflow tools. Just by way of background, we've seen Elsevier, Springer Nature's parent, Holtzbrinck through its digital science unit, Clarivate and some other groups extending their reach into other parts of the research workflow beyond just publishing. So things like authoring tools, metrics and analysis, preprints, altmetrics, etc. To what extent do you see these workflow tools creating a lock-in for researchers, not necessarily for libraries in the way that Liam was talking about, but for researchers? And are these products beginning to find their way into big deal models? Do you expect to see them offered as bundles of workflow tools, maybe not sold to the library? Or do you expect to see the possibility that some of these research platforms and research workflow tools will actually be packaged together with content licenses? How do you see the workflow tools coming together with the big deal model, if at all? I don't know, Jean, can I ask you to start us off on this one?
I'd be glad to, because I can say at the University of Utah before I left, one of the first things I did was work with our informatics and research offices on something called Myra, and it was My Research Assistant. And it was this whole idea that research life cycle is very complex with many players at different levels of expertise. And yet the institution has a lot of support and services available to these researchers, but it's often hidden or unknown. And what we did was try to create the research life cycle with components at each stage of the life cycle that were available from the university as well as in the broader universe to guide the researchers wherever they were entering that life cycle. And it was so successful that our Office of Research has it on their front page, the whole life cycle. But I think the point was that everybody's starting to realize that the research life cycle is changing as well. And big data is becoming much more the desired future content that is going to have to be disseminated and collected and identified, analyzed, critiqued, described, discovered, you name it. So I think it's a natural transition as the emphasis on big data has happened, that publishers are looking at the research life cycle and how, again, with Elsevier's interest in increasing research performance, it seems like a natural migration to be looking at the tools that researchers are using. I can also say internally we're working on different models, and so far my knowledge is that they will never be sold as one, you have to buy everything to get anything. And in fact, we're conscious of interoperability as our primary driving development driver, recognizing, again, you're not going to change a researcher's habit. If they've adopted a tool and they're very comfortable with it, they're not going to switch just because somebody licenses a complete package. So everyone's aware, I believe, of that, trying to get the best tool available to the researcher, but knowing the adoption may be very specific to each researcher, not even the institution. So I think we're just all trying to help as much as we can, but I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not super involved with pricing, but I definitely have heard the openness of data that Elsevier wants to support, the interoperability of the data and the tools, and plug and play with different other tools different publishers are producing, so that we really are getting to increasing the research performance as the ultimate goal.
Rick, do you have any reflections, or have you seen models here starting to develop from your perspective?
I haven't really seen workflow solutions being bundled into big deal offerings yet. I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing those. I would be surprised if, as Jean said, if a publisher were ever to say, in order to subscribe to these journals, you have to subscribe to these workflow solutions. That kind of lock-in, I would be surprised to see. One of the great myths about the big deal right now is that publishers force libraries to subscribe to their journals in big bundles. I'm not aware of any publisher that doesn't give you the option of subscribing to individual journals, including Elsevier. And so I'd be kind of surprised to see a substantial move away from that kind of flexibility. But I think the kind of potential lock-in that you have raised questions about, Roger, and others have as well, is a lock-in that arises not from being forced to buy something you don't want, but the kind that sort of evolves organically from a publisher or other entity having sort of ownership of more and more elements of the workflow, and so as a result you find yourself locked in rather than submitting to being forced to being locked in or whatever. And to the degree that choice is preserved in that model, it concerns me less. To the degree that choice is undermined, it concerns me more.
Liam, you mentioned you've started to talk to some providers about workflow issues. Has that come up in the context of the big deal, or how can you help us think this through from just perspective?
Well, I think as Rick said, I think we would be worried about anything which created lock-ins. I think we don't want to add these into our big deals for journals. We see the things that Jean mentioned around interoperability, around openness of data, around the use of standards as very important. I think that whilst we might use the same teams, might be involved in some of the licensing and negotiations and things like that, I think we see these as different products with different methods of evaluating them and procuring them. And I would be very surprised if we, in the short term at least, bundled these sorts of tools in with our journal negotiations. If anything, I think we might see a sort of a pivot perhaps away from the content towards purchasing more of these decision and analytics type tools, which seem to be of real value and interest to institutions.
And I can say that, the interest seems to be recognizing that the speed at which scholarly communication is happening and research has accelerated so much that wanting to share the research output sooner is a goal. And these tools, a lot of them, we've acquired our SSRC with the idea that this is a way to get research out sooner. And I know they've even been looking at sound bites of research output from researchers. How small can that soundbite be and still convey the research that's happening at institutions? So I see the whole research Lifecycle tools actually accelerating openness and also helping to enable researchers to share more rapidly. The lab notebook, idea, for us it's Hivebench, but the electronic notebook allows people to share at least within the institution if they wish, which I know at the U, and I'm sure the U is not different to any other university, knowing even internally who's working on what has often been a need that was expressed to the library. Can't you tell me who's working on what so I can connect with them? So I only see this whole research tool support as being more driven to share information sooner and more openly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've been tracking some cases where these products are being sold as a bundle or a portfolio to universities through their libraries. So there's a case where digital science has done that with Carnegie Mellon, I believe. There are some others that have received a little bit less attention. But yeah, to the question of how it fits in with the content packages seems like a very different kind of question. Even if they provide a seamless workflow for the researcher into publishing through the big deal, they don't necessarily end up getting sold with the journals at the same time, at least not at this point. So some very exciting tools and interesting models. But then again, I think we've seen across the discussion over the last 55 minutes or so, just how much is changing. There are one or two questions. I'm just looking back and noticing that I've omitted one or two questions that have come in, and I'll just ask a final wrap-up question. Can you summarize where you see the big deal going in the near future? What changes do you predict? And maybe if I could just ask for 30 seconds of very quick remarks from each of you. Liam, would you like to start, and then we'll go to Rick, and then finish with Jean?
I think from our point of view, in the near future, more and more evaluation of the big deals to make sure that we are getting the best possible value for money from them, that they are supporting our strategic objectives both at the local institutional and at the national level, and that we are not sorry. Can I hand over? I've managed to get something.
Yes, we'll hand over to Rick now. Thank you, Liam.
I agree with Liam, and I think we're seeing something similar in the U.S. There has been a growing number of libraries in recent years that have found sort of the courage to say, okay, we're going to cancel our big deals and see what happens. And based on the pretty limited data set that we have so far, one of the really striking things that I think is beginning to seem to be true is that when libraries do that, they don't tend to experience the blowback from their faculty and students that they anticipated. And of course, every library's experience is going to be different, and no library should either get into or get out of the big deal without doing due diligence. But that seems to be an emerging trend from what I'm seeing, and I think that trend is probably going to continue.
And Jean, you'll have the last word.
Well, that's the first time in my life, but I'm I think what my hope is that this big deal future is going to open doors for even more conversation and interaction with the authors. And I know that budgets with libraries are not growing, but I think we're going to hit a point where we're going to need to work with our authors on solving this problem together. And it shouldn't just be the library having to absorb all these cuts. It has to be recognized by the institution that if you don't support the library, and if you go to a different model, let's say another office all of a sudden gets an increase to support APCs, what does that mean? And so I want to take the Pollyanna approach to this and say, let's take this opportunity to open doors and to work with our researchers more in partnership, especially with the research tools that are coming out. I think it gives us this foray to a true understanding of what the needs are, and then also educating the flip side from the library about what the issues are that are coming to their futures as well as ours.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And I want to just hand over briefly to Jeff Lang now to wrap us up. Thank you to all three panelists. I'm so grateful for such an engaged and fulsome discussion today.
Absolutely. And thank you, Roger, for leading us, and Jean and Liam and Rick for your engagement during this discussion. It's really been excellent. Thank you also to the audience for attending. And once again, please do take time to respond to the webinar evaluation, which you'll receive in your email. Your feedback will help us to continually improve the webinar program. Please also join us for the next SSP webinar on April 17th at 11 a.m. Eastern, Breaking the Print Model in Digital Delivery. With that, we are concluded. Please enjoy the rest of your day.